Hi. Today I want to talk with you briefly about one of the traditional sources for Paul's understanding of Christ. Paul's theology derives from two different sources: direct revelation, and I mean by that his personal experience with the risen Christ on the Damascus Road, and secondly, early Christian traditions about Christ, which Paul apparently learned from early Christian sources. Now, most of those traditional sources of theology were concerned with Christology, the person and work of Christ. The first Christians were forever casting about looking for texts, images, and metaphors that would, in their experience, explain who Jesus was. These images and metaphors we today call Christologies, understandings of the person and work of Christ. According to F. Bruce, Paul, Apostle of the Heart Set Free, page 65, various early Christologies have been interwoven with each other throughout the history of Christian thought since the inception of Christianity. Bruce, when discussing primitive Christologies on page 65, says, and I quote, "In apostolic speeches of the early chapters of Acts, there are quite a number of interlacing Christologies," end quote. Then Bruce goes on to enumerate those Christologies. He was the anointed prince of the house of David. He was the humiliated and vindicated servant of the Lord. He was the promised prophet like Moses. Now, additionally, Bruce also points out that some of these Christologies employed impersonal metaphors, in addition to the personal ones delineated above. Chief among these impersonal metaphors was the so-called Rejected Stone Christology, in which Old Testament passages such as Isaiah 28:16 and Psalm 118:22 were pressed into service by the first Jewish Christians as a way of explaining the fact that they believed that Jesus, despite the fact that he was arrested and crucified, was nonetheless Israel's Messiah, and more than that, the Son of God. Bruce then goes on to make his most critical point, namely that these various Christologies that were pressed into service by the early church were not invented by the first Christians. Still less were they the creations of Luke, the author of Acts. Rather, the primitive and authentic character is witnessed by the fact that there is evidence that they existed prior to their use by the first New Testament writers in early Christian testimonia, collections of Old Testament texts brought together by the first Jewish Christians as a way of affirming their belief that Jesus was, in fact, the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. These testimonia were apparently brought together quite early and are witnessed to by multiple New Testament writers, all working independently of each other. Paul, it seems, was aware of these testimonia and utilized them in his writings. This is easily demonstrable with the so-called Rejected Stone Christology. In Old Testament texts, such as Isaiah 28:16 and Psalm 118:22, Israel's prophets and poets work with a theme that, on their view, helped to explain the disconnect that, on the one hand, Israel was the chosen elect people of God, but on the other hand, they were also a despised, rejected, and persecuted people. Now, how do you account for this, they asked. To answer, they came up with a metaphor or illustration that helped them to explain what they thought was going on, namely, the rejected stone theology. The metaphor, coming from the building industry, pictured a pile of stones, all different sizes and shapes, which the stonemason employed to construct his structure. In the pile was this odd, misshapen stone that seemed ill-suited for the task at hand. Hence, the mason walked around the stone and chose others that, in his judgment, were better suited for his purposes. However, as he neared the end of the construction project, he had only one hole left to be filled by a stone. When he returned to the pile to find a stone that would fit, the only stone that worked was, you guessed it, the same odd, misshapen stone he had been walking around and avoiding. It turned out that not only was that stone not rejected and useless, indeed, it was the most important stone of all. It was the cornerstone, the capstone, the stone that held the entire structure together. Now, that was the illustration. Israel's prophets and poets used this illustration to say that stone is Israel. Israel was not only not the pariah of the nations, rather it was God's own chosen elect people, the most important people of all. The first Christians, being Jews, and knowing this rejected stone theology, took it over and changed it slightly in order to press it into the service of their faith. You see, first century Jews rejected the earliest Christians' notion that Jesus was Messiah precisely because he had been crucified. Messiahs, Jews believed, don't get crucified. In their minds, that made Jesus a loser, and Messiah, they believed, would be a winner, not a loser. Hence, they called Jesus a fraud, and those who followed him duped, misguided Jews. But the first Jewish Christians took up from the Old Testament this very same theology and modified it to make it refer to Jesus. Now he, rather than Israel, was the rejected stone, the one whom the Jews, rather than the pagan nations, had rejected, but who turned out to be God's chosen, precious cornerstone, the stone that held up the entire structure. It was a stroke of genius, or perhaps better, inspiration. That rejected stone Christology was widely known and used by the first Jewish Christian believers who wanted to keep the Old Testament as their sacred scripture. Paul, for example, who primarily knows the Old Testament in its Greek, that is, Septuagintal form, also knows the Old Testament in collections of early Christian testimonia, which he cites on occasion in his letters. We have evidence of this in such places as Romans 9:33, where Paul quotes Isaiah 28:16 from the Septuagint. Just as it stands written, "Behold, I have set in Zion a stone of stumbling, a rock of scandal, and the one believing in him should not be made ashamed." My translation of Paul's Greek. Two words, however, in Paul's citation of Isaiah 28:16 are not present in the original Septuagint version of Isaiah 28:16. In him, referring to Christ. Paul, it seems, added those two words in order to make it clear that he's referring to Jesus, not Israel. Amazingly, Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 6, does exactly the same thing. Therefore, it is contained in Scripture, "Behold, I have set in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, precious, chosen, and the one believing in him should by no means be made ashamed." My translation of Peter's Greek. Here again, Peter, working independently of Paul, adds the same two words, in auto in Greek, in him, to the Septuagint text that Paul adds in Romans 9:33 in order to make the passage refer to Jesus instead of Israel as it originally did. Now, there are two possible explanations of this. One, Paul and Peter independently make exactly the same change to the Septuagint text in exactly the same place, not likely. Or two, both Paul and Peter are independently citing another source, an early Christian testimonia of Isaiah 28:16, a testimonia that had already made this change to the Septuagint text in order to support the first Christians' belief that Jesus was indeed the Messiah of Israel's expectation and the Scripture's prophecy, a more likely probability. Hence, we know that such collections existed because Paul and Peter both appear to quote them independently of each other. Bruce, in your reading assignment, is pointing out that Acts 4:11 appears to be dependent on this very same rejected stone Christology employed by the first Christians, albeit in Acts 4:11 the Old Testament passage pressed into service was Psalm 118:22, not Isaiah 28:16. In order to testify to their faith that Jesus, the rejected and crucified Nazarene, was none other than the Messiah, the Son of God. Well, I hope that helps you to understand a bit better some of the traditional sources of Paul's theology, such as these Old Testament collections of texts used by the first Jewish Christians in order to press their claim that Jesus was Israel's Messiah and God's Son. Until next time, take care. God bless.